The world is split by a line no one can see, yet everyone will soon feel. In 1494, a meridian inked on parchment decides which winds, shores, and souls belong to which crown. Caravels creak in their moorings, while candles gutter in a stone hall at Tordesillas. A few strokes of a quill try to tame oceans that have never obeyed anyone. What set the world on a collision course in 1494? Consider the line no one could see. 2 years earlier, a Genoese pilot sailing for Castile crashed into islands that Europe had not charted. At the same time, Portugal tightened its grip on Atlantic stepping stones and the gold and pepper routes along Africa. The shock of discovery collided with the logic of monopoly. Both kingdoms had too much to win to leave anything to chance, and too much to lose to let gunpowder decide. Why did they choose a meridian and not a treaty of vague courtesies? Because numbers on maps could do what oaths in halls could not. A straight north-south line west of the Cape Verde Islands promised a neat partition between the spheres. Neat on paper, dangerous at sea, and irresistible to rulers who believed that geometry could be destiny. The number mattered. 370 leagues west of the outermost island. Shift it a little and you moved the future language of a continent. Who actually held the pen in Tordesillas? Look past the wax seals and you will see pilots, cosmographers, and bankers whispering through the ink. Emissaries bargained because their monarchs needed time more than triumphs. Time to expand shipyards, train crews, and lock down spice circuits before rivals learned to steer by the same stars. Portugal feared that a line too close to Europe would choke its African lifeline and its door to the Indian Ocean. Castile feared that Rome's first sketch would shrink its newborn ocean frontier before it could even stand. How do you police a boundary when no one can measure longitude precisely? You don't. You argue it into usefulness. Latitude could be read with an astrolabe or a quadrant under a clear sky. Longitude remained phantom, a guess stitched from dead reckoning, sandglasses, and the stubborn memory of helmsmen. So the line became less a wall and more a moving belt of persuasion. Captains crossed it unseeing while councils argued over where their pilots swore it lay yesterday. Why does Brazil speak Portuguese when Spanish fills the rest of South America? Because cartography and coastline conspired to give Lisbon a bite of the future. Push the meridian far enough west, and the great eastern bulge of South America falls into the Portuguese sphere. When Pedro Alvarez Cabral's fleet sighted that green shore in 1500, law and geography shook hands. The wordless treaty in the surf read as clearly as any Latin clause. By right of line and right of landing, a new province of the Portuguese crown had arrived. What role did the papacy play if the final word belonged to two crowns? It blessed, it nudged, and then it watched the diplomats do arithmetic with its blessing. Early bulls lent moral weight to Castile's claim to the west. Lisbon pushed back until the choreography produced a bilateral pact both could live with and both could flex. Where theology ended, accounting began. The treaty transubstantiated faith into freight, absolution into shipping lanes. How did the line reshape gears of government on both sides of Iberia? By turning maps into secrets and ports into filters. In Seville, the Casa de la Contratación guarded the master chart like a state jewel and trained pilots to think by meridians. In Lisbon, factors and cartographers stitched a private atlas of winds and monsoons that could be shared with fleets, but not with friends. Each stamped copy of the official padron was a passport and a leash. To sail without it invited storms, corsairs, and lawsuits you could not win. Why is this still our problem 5 centuries later? Because the treaty's ghost still edits our atlases and our arguments. Brazil's Portuguese tongue, codes of law, and colonial land grants grew from a clause written for a world that thought in leagues. Spanish America's viceroyalties, trade monopolies, and port hierarchies matured within a grid drawn to respect a meridian that no ship could see. Modern pipelines, grains, and shipping routes often trace rhythms set by 17th century bays and 18th century customs houses. When we fight over cables, satellites, and seabed minerals, we are still haggling over where to draw invisible lines. What did ordinary sailors know of treaties while wrestling ropes in black water? Only that the night was long and the reckoning longer. A helmsman counted heartbeats while a sand glass bled its throat of grains. A navigator raised brass to a cold star and hoped the math would hold to dawn. Every noon, a captain planted an X on a damp logbook where today's world would be made to fit. Between that X and the imagined line lay days of current, squalls, and decisions no lawyer could unmake. How did people already living on those coasts experience a boundary they had never heard of? As a sudden grammar of power that insisted on baptisms, tributes, and markets run on new rules. Languages collided, sometimes braided, sometimes broken. Diseases ran faster than letters, and with them ran rumors of gods, kings, and iron. Some communities moved inland, others traded, others fought, and many did all three in cycles as regular as seasons. The line did not command them, but it commanded the men who arrived, insisting that a distant ink stroke owned their sky. Why did paper maps become such dangerous objects? Because the first nation to own the truth of a coast owns tomorrow's profit and safety. A copied chart with an extra cove or a corrected reef could trim weeks from a voyage. It could also move the practical soul of the line far to one side of where the treaty rested. When thieves went hunting in archives, they hunted the future in rolled parchment. A single stolen coastline could rob a crown without firing a single arquebus. Did the meridian hold when the world suddenly had another ocean to divide? It held by being mirrored. Once ships had stitched a circumnavigation into human memory, everyone realized the line had a twin on the far side. The logic of Tordesillas demanded a balance in seas the signatories had barely imagined in 1494. Arguing over spice archipelagos meant arguing in degrees, minutes, and reputations. The conversation that began in a Castilian town stretched across monsoons and decades. What changed in the art of navigation that made promises on paper harder to stretch? Practice, tables, and better habits hardened guesswork into culture. Pilots wrote more careful derroteros, compared notes, and refined routines for reading the sun and the stars. They were still wrong often and gloriously, but less often than their fathers. Each small improvement clipped a little fog from the meridian. Courts and captains found it easier to say you were here and not there, and that here belonged to whom the treaty said. How did economies on both sides of the line specialize under its shadow? Like water pressed into channels by a levee you cannot see. Brazil leaned into sugar, timber, and later gold, with enslaved labor grinding the gears of mills and mines. Spanish America stacked silver on llamas and mules and moved it as if moving a nervous river in chests and fleets. The line gave each sphere a logic that builders, priests, smugglers, and governors learned by repetition. Patterns became policies and policies became identities. What legal phrases carried the meridian into courtrooms, classrooms, and town squares? The language of grants, cedulas, and audiencia verdicts turned the line into a habit of thinking. Chronicles repeated the names and the distances until they sounded natural to ears that had never seen the ocean. Students learned that the world could be organized and that maps were arguments dressed as facts. When borders eventually hardened on land, they did so along rivers, mountains, and memories trained by older lines. A treaty with a nautical problem raised children with geopolitical answers. Why should anyone who writes code, lays fiber, or ships lithium care about 1494? Because you are still living inside a world trained to respect invisible fences. From time zones to data sovereignty, from exclusive economic zones to orbital slots, power negotiates grids and corridors. It then pretends those lines are nature. Knowing how Tordesillas was drawn teaches you how other meridians get justified now. If your industry lives on maps without trees, you still answer to cartography. What did the line mean to the people who knelt in churches and to those who listened from the shadows outside? It meant that prayers, taxes, and punishments had new calendars. Some found protection in missions, others survived by trading through new hierarchies. Others lost land, names, and kin to epidemics and extractions. Yet everywhere, there was adaptation alongside grief. Music, crops, and techniques leaped the line in the night long before diplomats admitted it by day. How did secrecy and smuggling tangle with the neatness of the meridian? By proving that straight lines bend easily in human hands. Kings wanted order, but profit likes shortcuts. When an inlet offered a safer anchorage or a headland hid a cove, a captain who could count to 10 could count the reasons to ignore a clause. The meridian remained the law, but practice wrote footnotes in salt spray. The result was a long negotiation between what was commanded and what was possible. What remains when candles go out in Tordesillas and the last clerk closes the chest of maps? A silence full of consequences, languages that bind strangers, borders that channel trade, and memories that still argue across tables in ministries and boardrooms. A world that believes lines can civilize chaos, even when chaos keeps making the rules. Every time we accept a boundary because it is tidy, we are back in that hall, with the quill hovering. We are trusting a line to do the work of wisdom. How do we carry the warning without ignoring the brilliance of those who measured the sky with brass and patience? By honoring the craft while doubting the absolutes. The pilots and chart makers made an unknown sphere navigable with courage and instruments the size of a hand. Their accuracy grew the space in which law and commerce could move without murdering sense. But the confidence their work enabled sometimes disguised choices that were political more than natural. It still does, and the price is always paid by those who do not get to sign the map. What do you see if you look at the line today, not with nostalgia, but with responsibility? Two families of nations with a quarrelsome kinship and a shared appetite for the sea. One speaks mostly Spanish, one speaks Portuguese, and both have built modern identities atop colonial scaffolding. They trade within patterns set by ports 3 centuries old and argue in courts defined by codes born of the same ink. Understanding that inheritance makes present choices less naive. It exposes where tradition is wisdom and where it is merely habit. What is the last truth that the meridian of 1494 whispers across the surf of 5 centuries? That maps are promises, and promises need guardians. A line drawn to stop a war gave shape to empires and to resistances. It still murmurs in flight paths, shipping lanes, and the invisible boundaries of your phone. If a line no one could see divided an ocean and scripted a continent, what invisible line are we accepting today without asking who benefits from it?